So we're on our second lesson of our new book. Yay! Thanks, Sister Debbie, for ordering them. She always makes sure we have them on time. We were thinking we were fixing to do a couple of the ones we missed out on the last one, and she had it right there, right on time, like 2 days before. It's perfect. So today's lesson is God hears Elijah's prayer. Last week, Sister Kayleen spoke to us about God's supply, that God will supply. And that was part of the story of Elijah. And now this part is going to refer to another portion of his life. God hears Elijah's prayer. Our focus thought for today is that God honors his preacher's prayers. Something special about when our pastor prays for us.
That's right.
Not just any other person, but when we know that they're praying for us. Our text comes from 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 17 through 24. Our focus verse will be 24, but since they're in order, I'm going to read them in order. And it came to pass after these things that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, fell sick, and his sickness was so sore that there was no breath left in him. And she said unto Elijah, What have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? Art thou come unto me to call my sin to remembrance and to slay my son? And he said unto her, Give me thy son. And he took him out of her bosom and carried him up into a loft where he abode and laid him upon his own bed. And he cried unto the Lord and said, O Lord my God, hast thou also brought evil upon the widow with whom I sojourn, by slaying her son? And he stretched himself upon the child 3 times, and cried unto the Lord, and said, O Lord my God, I pray thee, let this child's soul come into him again. And the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child, and brought him down out of the chamber into the house, and delivered him unto his mother. And Elijah said, See, thy son liveth. Our focus verse is verse 24, which says, And the woman said to Elijah, Now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in thy mouth is truth. Culture connection for this topic is called Bayou Bartholomew. In July of 1989, Jerry Self and his brother-in-law were faced with the reality that in 3 hours, 500 acres of sweet potatoes would be underwater. 12 inches of rainfall had pushed the Bayou Bartholomew out of its banks, and it had reached the edge of Jerry's farmland. In desperation, he called his pastors, A.J. and Dwight Colton, to come pray for a miracle. Both pastors arrived quickly. The men sat on a log that had floated to the edge of the field out of the bayou, and they began to pray. After the pastors left, Jerry continued to monitor the water and found it had stopped rising. Believing the water had crested, Jerry checked the water levels north and south of him, only to learn the water was still rising. Jerry continually checked the gauges and spoke with other farmers, again to receive the same report. The water was still rising. He went back to his fields, wondering what he would find, but the water continually stayed back. For 30 days the water threatened, but it never rose higher than where the 4 men had sat and prayed. Just as God heard Elijah's prayer, he hears the prayers of those he calls to watch over his people. It is no secret that in every sector, United States society is experiencing a crisis of authority. From the childhood vaccination debates to the election of President Trump, skepticism of the tried and true and the experts has gripped the nation. In 2017, secular social scientist Tom Nichols published The Death of Expertise, the campaign against established knowledge and why it matters, exploring the troubling aspects of this trend. For Nichols, this death of expertise is rooted in a rejection not only of knowledge, but of the ways in which we gain knowledge and learn about things. Fundamentally, it's a rejection of science and rationality, which are the foundations of Western civilization itself. That's found on thefederalist.com. However, Nichols' analysis, though intriguing, seems to miss the real issue. The ultimate source of this growing skepticism is not a loss of faith and expertise as such, but a loss of faith in experts. The crisis of authority is not a crisis of scientific rationality, but a crisis of personal integrity. It's kind of a tough one to swallow, isn't it? So in the scriptures we find there's a crisis in the era of the kings. First reading the rise of King Ahab. After the death of the northern kingdom's first king, Jeroboam, the nation almost instantaneously plunged into a protracted civil war. Baasha of the tribe of Issachar overthrew Jeroboam's son Nadab after 2 years. That was found in 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 26 through 28. Only to have his own son, Elah, assassinated after 2 years by his captain Zimri, as found in 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 8 through 10. Zimri himself reigned a grand total of 7 days. Must have been a terrible man. Before being overthrown by another military captain, Omri, who was able to finally bring stability. 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 15 and verse 23. What is missing entirely in the story of Omri's rise to power is any sort of prophetic mandate for his actions. Even the ill-fated Zimri had at least the credible authorization of the prophet Jehu ben Hanani for his attack on Elah. That's found in 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 1 through 4 and verse 7. Though little is said of Omri in the Bible, his greatest military accomplishment, which was conquering Moab, was mentioned in the famous Moabite stone. In other words, Omri and the dynasty that followed him were among the first kings after Solomon to have an international reputation and pivotal role in the ancient Near Eastern geopolitical drama. A key part of the reason for Omri's power and prominence was his alliance with the king of Sidon, which made the northern kingdom a vital link in international trade, bringing Israel into a new era of wealth and political influence. The rise of idol worship. None of this is mentioned in the Bible narrative for a very specific reason. The way Omri sealed his covenant with the king of Sidon was to have his son, Ahab, marry the Sidonian princess Jezebel. The Sidonians were worshippers of the false Canaanite god, Baal. For the writer of Kings, this spelled disaster for the nation, for it meant the reintroduction of a loathsome, false god into Israel's national life. That is why the writer of Kings included the following note in the narrative of Ahab's ascension to power in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 34, which reads, In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram, his firstborn. Let me reread this. In his days did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram, his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. Not only does this text demonstrate the prophetic stature of Joshua, but it also symbolizes the striking reversal between Israel's triumph under Joshua and the tragedy under Ahab. That's found in a book written by Bruce K. Waltke, which is an Old Testament theology. Under Ahab, Baal worship was not simply tolerated. It was promoted as the official state religion of Israel. Goodness, how far have they fallen? 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 31 to 33. God's explicit purpose for giving the Israelites the promised land was to punish the Canaanites for their false worship. That's found in Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 through 16, and also Joshua chapter 3, verse 10. The marriage of Ahab and Jezebel represented the very undoing of Israel's conquest of the land under Joshua, even to the rebuilding of the evil city of Jericho. Wow. The demands of obedience never change. There are two important lessons to draw from the story of Ahab's rise to power. First, God is not impressed or moved by worldly standards of success. Most historians agree that Omri and Ahab were two of the most powerful kings Israel had ever known. In fact, at the Battle of Karkar, King Ahab was able to field an army of 10,000 infantry soldiers and 2,000 chariots, and was essentially the military leader of the coalition that confronted the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. This is found in a book written by Victor P. Hamilton, which is called the Handbook on the Historical Books. Sorry, these titles of these books killed. Okay. However, despite the military and economic might of Omri and Ahab, they failed the one test of good success, as found in Joshua chapter 1, verse 8. They were not faithful to God or his covenant. The second important lesson to draw from these stories is that God's demands for obedience never changed. Though centuries separate the time of Joshua from the time of Ahab, God still abhorred the gods of the Canaanites and all that their worship entailed. Not the cultural shift, nor the need for economic stability, nor the desire for international recognition were sufficient reasons for sacrificing Israel's strict loyalty to God. The actions of Omri and Ahab were sinful because they were rooted in a lack of trust in God to provide those things in his own way and time. Wow. Why? This is a question for thought. Why are worldly definitions of success both so attractive and so dangerous?
Because it stimulates your pride and your ego. You have success, worldly success. And it can be dangerous because then you get on the trip and then you pride goes before a fall.
Anytime we get our own power by our own method, we have to sustain that power by our own method. We as humans cannot handle that. If it doesn't come from God, it's not sustainable. Any other ones? How many times did I do that? Kind of a tough one, huh? Here we are back to the portrayal of Elijah. He was a man of purpose. Into this charged religious and political arena stepped the mysterious man Elijah. Perhaps what is most noticeable is how little we know about him. No one is quite sure of the whereabouts of Tishbe, which is Elijah's hometown. The writer of Kings does not provide us with the name of Elijah's father, or even the tribe to which he belonged. The only thing we know about Elijah is the meaning of his name. Yahweh is my God. What a great, powerful name. And perhaps, in the end, that is all we need to know about him. Elijah's name was his mission. He was a prophet raised up by God to combat the state-sanctioned rise of false worship. The devil does not change his tactics. He's doing the same thing now. Isn't that crazy?
Try it.
Didn't work the first time. Maybe it sort of worked. Convinced enough man of prayer. The only other thing we know about Elijah is he was a man of prayer. A grand total of 14 separate prayer sessions, that's pretty amazing, are recorded in 1 Kings chapters 17 through 19. Do we really know of anyone else in the Bible that we read that many different events that they prayed about and they were effective? That's pretty awesome. 3 things are noteworthy about Elijah's prayers. First, his prayers are striking in their simplicity. The Bible is no stranger to lengthy prayers. For example, you can find in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 22 through 53. That's a pretty long prayer, right? Not just like one sentence or 3 verses. However, Elijah's prayer in chapter 17 was almost breathtakingly brief. O Lord my God, I pray thee, let this child's soul come into him again. Straight to the point, wouldn't he? 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 21. Later, in Matthew's record of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus extolled the same kind of prayer. But when ye pray, use not vain repetitions, as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. Be not ye therefore like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things ye have need of, before ye ask him. Matthew chapter 6, verses 7 and 8.
Amen.
We've all had, let's see, we're all kind of older here. Most of us have had children, so we've all had that, mama, 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 daddy, 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 daddy. Or they like just keep saying the same thing over and over again. So I think, the point is God heard us the first time around, right? Second, Elijah's prayers are notable for their honesty, especially in his encounter with God on Mount Horeb in 1 Kings chapter 19. Elijah was very open with his own feelings of isolation and perhaps even despair. Like David and the other psalmists, Elijah demonstrated honesty to be the hallmark of fervent prayer. In his honesty, Elijah became, for the Apostle James, a model man of prayer, as found in James 5 and 17. Finally, Elijah's prayers were notable in their persistence. He prayed 3 times for the widow's son to be resurrected, 1 Kings 17 and 21. He prayed 7 times for the rains to fall and end the 3-year-long drought, as found in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 43. In Luke 18 and 1, we find Jesus' parable of the unjust judge was intended to teach this very lesson, that men ought always to pray and not to faint.
Right.
Besides honesty and persistence, what are 2 or 3 other keys to effective prayer that you have discovered in your own life? How about specificity? Specificity, sorry.
Say it again.
Specificity. It says, besides honesty and persistence, what are 2 or 3 other keys to effective prayer that you have discovered in your own life? Anyone?
Keeping a consistent time.
Consistent time.
I heard a preacher the other day say that he always, when he first gets up, the first thing he does is pray. He said he tithes his time in prayer every morning, just like we tithe our money. He said, because if you don't, just like with your finances, things will come along throughout your finances where you won't pay your tithes. Things will come out throughout the day where you don't get your time. He said, so to me, that's a big one, is keeping that consistent time. If it's first thing in the morning or just before you go to bed, whatever works best. To me, that was a pretty powerful statement that he had there.
I think being deliberate about prayers, praying pointed prayers is very effective. One of the most effective public about it. Don't hit all around with God. Be pointed about what you need, what you want, what you want to see God do.
Right.
Anyone else? This is supposed to be interactive. Is anybody awake? I'm not letting you sleep, am I? This works for Mark. He gets to sleep. The importance of spiritual authority. In the Old Testament, Elijah was an iconic example of spiritual authority. It is often forgotten that Baal's role in the Canaanite pantheon was as the god of storms, which consists of lightning and rain. When Elijah announced, "As the Lord God of Israel liveth," that's pretty cool. "As the Lord God of Israel liveth," or Elizabeth, sorry. Try this one more time. "As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain in these years, but according to my word." 1 Kings 17:11. He was establishing that God was the only God and was the only one that can control the things that they thought they had gods that controlled.
That's right.
That's pretty awesome, right? He was directly challenging Baal's claims. Not even Baal's claims, it was the people who thought there was a Baal. According to the Canaanite Baal myth, drought signaled, this is great, drought signaled the death of the god. So for 3 years they had to deal with the drought that was telling them, hey, your God's not even alive.
That's right.
Did they get it? I don't know. In fact, when Elijah stormed into Ahab's presence that day, Elijah, through Yahweh's power, killed Baal.
That's right.
That's fabulous. Elijah's spiritual authority may have been demonstrated in miraculous signs and wonders, but it was clearly rooted in Elijah's prayers. The power is behind the prayer, right?
That's right.
Charles H. Kraft was correct in saying, "Spiritual authority is in direct proportion to spiritual intimacy." This is found in the Evangelical's Guide to Spiritual Warfare. As with all other forms of authority, spiritual authority comes with associated responsibilities. A pastor who has been granted spiritual oversight of a congregation has a spiritual obligation to uphold his congregants in intercessory prayer. At the end of his life, Samuel the prophet and judge said to the children of Israel, "Moreover, as for me, God forbid that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you." That is in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 23. There is one final truth about the nature of spiritual authority revealed in the Elijah stories. Spiritual authority must grow and develop. The stories recorded in 1 Kings 17 show a definite progression in terms of the prophet's own authority. As Richard D. Nelson puts it, Elijah moves from passive to active readiness. In the first story, he simply obeys and is fed. In the second, he reports what God will do. In the third, he takes an active role and the Lord listens to him. 1 and 2 Kings. If Elijah had not undergone these 3 tests of faith, each increasing the level of required trust exponentially, it is more than likely he would not have been adequately prepared for the showdown with the false prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18. The raising of the widow's son convinced Elijah once and for all that God does hear and answer prayer, and he can do miracles that have never been seen before. How should believers go about the process of developing spiritual authority? Anyone have a thought? We should have coffee before we start this.
Say that again.
I had mine.
Say that again.
How should believers go about the process of developing spiritual authority? We have to pray, right? We have to fast.
It
To read our word.
kind of goes back to that last question where, developing that consistent, persistent, deliberate prayer life.
Yeah.
I think that you can't really develop spiritual authority without relationship, so kind of along the same lines of what everyone else is saying, you have to have the relationship.
You have to build trust.
Yeah, there has to be trust between you and God and your leaders, right? So relationship building, very good. That's a good thought. Power of a praying preacher. The widow first trusted Elijah. Guys are on the mark. The stories recorded in 1 Kings 17 form a kind of interlocked narrative united by their focus on the problem of imminent death and the divine gift of life via miraculous means. This is another book by Nelson again. One cannot tell the story of the resurrection of the widow's son without including, in some way, the prior story of the miraculous provision of food for the prophet, the widow, and her son for over 2 years. It was a daily feeding because that oil, or what they were eating, their pot of flour, I guess it was, meal, was only sufficient for that day. But for 2 years, they were learning to get that they could get their daily needs provided for them.
It's good. Consistency, it's good.
It must be noted that Zarephath was in Sidonian territory, the heart of Baal's country. Elijah had taken his fight against the false god to the God's own homeland. To the point again, right? The text makes it clear this widow prepared the meal Elijah requested with the last bit of food she had been saving for her and her son. She had so much faith in the prophet's words that she was willing to risk starvation in her obedience. The text is also clear that the widow acted according to the saying of Elijah, found in 1 Kings 17 and 15. Prior to her encounter with the prophet Elijah, this woman had been a worshiper of Baal. She did not know or worship Yahweh, the God of Elijah. She acted, at least at first, on her faith in the prophet. There was something about Elijah himself that inspired trust, hope, and courage in this woman. Another question for thought. Do you think you would be able to trust in and act upon a word from a man or woman of God like this widow did? Why or why not? She had to believe that she and her son were not going to die at his very word. And she gave up the very last of what she had for him.
That took faith and obedience.
Right.
Maybe she just thought, well, we're going to die anyway. What's one more day? But if you knew that's all you had, and you truly loved your child, even more than your own self-preservation, to give up what you knew that child needed for someone, maybe she didn't even know him very well. That took a lot of something. Courage, right? The widow was led to trust in God. Because of her courageous act of obedience to God's word through the prophet Elijah, miraculous provision occurred. However, an even greater miracle is that this poor Sidonian widow came to be a believer in the God of Elijah. This can be seen in her grieved petition after the death of her son. What have I to do with thee, O thou man of God? 1 Kings 17 and 18. The widow then recognized that Elijah's spiritual authority came from the one true God, not from himself or from any of the gods of the Sidonians who had proven unable to provide sustenance during the drought and famine. What followed was the first recorded resurrection story in the Bible. Because of this Sidonian widow's faith and the prophet Elijah's persistent prayers, God performed a miracle he had never performed before, raising a person from the dead. It was this final miraculous sign that elicited the widow's full confession of faith. Now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in thy mouth is true. 1 Kings 17:24. The importance of spiritual integrity. It is important to notice that the woman believed in the prophet before she believed in the prophet's God. The trustworthy character of the prophet led the woman to trust in the character of the God whom the prophet proclaimed. If the widow had not trusted Elijah, she would have continued with her original plan, and that meager meal would have been her last. But because she chose to trust the prophet, her life and her son's life were saved. In addition, the widow's decision to trust required that Elijah present himself and his God as trustworthy. In other words, Elijah's character and demeanor in these stories are crucial to the widow's discovery of the true character of God. Elijah was not simply called to represent God by performing mighty signs and wonders in his name. More fundamentally, Elijah was called to represent God by exhibiting his characteristic faithfulness to his covenant promises. A life of spiritual authority is rooted in a life of spiritual integrity. And a life of spiritual integrity can only be rooted in a quest to consistently model the character of God revealed fully in Jesus Christ. Without the integrity of Christ-like character, spiritual authority becomes a weapon that is wielded for one's own benefit rather than for the cause of Christ and his kingdom. Sadly, many have been driven away from God because those who claim to represent him do not display spiritual integrity. We should thank God every day for the blessing of spiritual leaders who lead with integrity. Our last question for God is, name 2 or 3 ways spiritual integrity might be differentiated from integrity of character. Can one exist without the other? And why or why not?
Read
That's
it
a
again.
tough question.
Read it again.
Name 2 or 3 ways spiritual integrity might be differentiated from integrity of character. Can one exist without the other? Why or why not? The Bible tells us a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. I think we've probably all known someone who we held in spiritual esteem, who at some point made decisions that caused us to mistrust them, their own personal character. And at that point, it determined whether we could accept their spiritual integrity.
I think they coincide.
Yeah.
I believe they're very closely linked.
They're hand in hand, yeah.
I think you can hold one for a period of time,
Yeah.
but once the underneath is revealed, that's the heart of the man, isn't it?
Right.
God knows what's in our hearts, and it will eventually be revealed by our actions and by our words, which is where our integrity is at, right? Anybody want to answer that question beside me?
Well, we're seeing it right now with the riots. Because the spiritual integrity of the people, they know it, but they're doing other things because of their will to sin. They know better, they're doing it anyway. We see that every day.
So, the last part of this is internalizing the message. It's another story. A baker in a little country town bought the butter he used from a nearby farmer. One day, he suspected that the bricks of butter were not full pounds, and for several days, he weighed them. He was right. They were short of the advertised weight, and he had the farmer arrested. At the trial, the judge said to the farmer, "I presume you have scales." "No, Your Honor." "Then how do you manage to weigh the butter you sell?" inquired the judge. The farmer replied, "That's easily explained, Your Honor. I have balances, and for a weight I use a 1 pound loaf I buy from the baker." It's gonna get back to haunt you, isn't it? Warren Buffett, chairman and CEO of the investment company Berkshire Hathaway, once said, "In looking for people to hire, look for 3 qualities: integrity, intelligence, and energy." Ooh, wouldn't that be awesome? And if you don't have the first one, the other 2 will kill you. You'll be fighting them all the way, trying to get them to figure it out, won't you? They'll always be 5 steps ahead of you. We live in a world that is hungry for leadership with integrity, especially spiritual leadership. We also live in a world where that kind of leadership is in increasingly short supply. Today, the world of Christendom is being rocked by abuse scandals that make the televangelist scandals of the 1980s appear tame and almost trifling. At its root, this cultural search for integrity is the cry of a heart that longs for something to believe in. Let me reread that, sorry. At its root, this cultural search for integrity is the cry of a heart that longs for something to believe in that will not disappoint or fail. We know the only fulfilling end for such a quest is a relationship with God, the only one who is ultimately trustworthy and unchanging. Sad to say, we as humans base our spiritual belief a lot of times on what we see displayed.
Right.
The reason I say that is because, like we were reading, it was talking about the relationship had to be built between the widow and the prophet. So, if that trust had not been there for them, she would not have come to believe, to trust in God whom she cannot see.
Right.
Because all she had ever been taught was about a God who really didn't even exist.
Right.
As parents, we're careful to teach our children values and to believe in things that are real. And it's sad to say, we did not teach our children to believe in Santa Claus. Because there's a myth of fairy tales that pile upon one another, and if we're continually teaching our children that these mythical things are truly real. I guess we taught them a story. There's a man that gave out gifts, and so this became a big deal, and they just kept continuing the tradition of that. But rather than teach them to believe, how are you going to teach them to believe in something they cannot see to be real if you're continually teaching them all this list of things that, oh, I can't see it, but it's real. When they come to the real, there's no line of distinction. So my purpose in saying that was, we've got to be real, and we need to build relationships with people if we're going to win them.
Amen.
Because first of all, they're going to be won by our testimony of our life and the relationship they have with us.
That's right.
They've got to know that God is real to us, that we're not just talking about something we don't believe in, because if our life doesn't reflect that we believe in God, because we don't believe in, it's sort of like the child that keeps doing the bad things because they're told, I'm going to get you, nothing ever happens. There are repercussions for not following God's plan. A lot of times we have to face them at the expense of our bad decisions that we've made and the effects of them. But we can also see God's hand when He heals, when He turns things around for us. And as we share those testimonies and as we share our victories of overcoming things that we couldn't have without God, then they start to see a real God. They start to see the real God.
That's right.
And that He's real in our life. So even though we may have storms that we have to face, they're there for a reason.
Right.
That's right.
God came walking on the water. Jesus walked to His disciples on the water. They were sitting in the midst of a storm that was raging around them. But as He walked on the water to them, He ended up calming the waves for them.
That's right.
And then they saw that God was in control of the circumstances really the whole time. And that He was watching them, He saw them, and He helped them. Just because we're Christians doesn't mean life doesn't happen.
That's right.
It doesn't mean that things just happen, because it's a cycle of events that are in play. The more we pray, though, the more often those effects are less harmful.
That's right.
So, our relationship, if we'll model a relationship with God for ourselves, then others will have the opportunity to see that there's a real, and that it can help them. And if they see that it can help them, that's probably what's going to inspire them first, a need for help. And whether they know it or not, they need help.
Yes, they do.
We all need help from God. God made it that way because He wanted somebody that loved Him, had a choice to love Him, but He also had that need to be God. He's God. And He wanted to show His abilities and prove Himself to us.
Amen.
So, anyways, thankful for this church, each one of you guys. God bless you.